The moment the master alarm shrieked through the silent facility, a sound I'd only ever heard during drills, I knew I was breaking protocol by not calling it in immediately. But something deeper, a primal urge that had been festering since the whispers of last week, pulled me towards the control room. The reinforced gates at sublevel 7 were shuddering, their steel groaning like a living thing in agony, a rhythmic, bone-jarring thud against their unyielding strength. They told me nothing could escape this place. The words echoed in my mind, a hollow reassurance that felt increasingly like a lie. I had to see for myself what was trying to break free. What kind of prison doesn't even put names on its inmates, only designations? I didn't realize then that curiosity was merely a precursor to a far more insidious affliction, one that would consume me entirely. My hand still remembers the chill of the keycard reader, the click that unlocked the heavy door to the archives, a place even most senior personnel are forbidden without multiple authorizations. The lights hummed, casting long, dancing shadows from the towering shelves that stretched into oppressive darkness, holding secrets that could unravel the very fabric of belief. This was the true vault, not of gold or jewels, but of forgotten histories, redacted scriptures, and the accumulated dread of centuries. I should have stopped when my fingers brushed against the binding of the Codex Gigas itself, tucked away on a lower shelf, a grim sentinel among lesser-known horrors. But I kept going, driven by the strange vibration in the floor, the relentless thudding from below, a rhythm that was starting to feel intentional. The alarms continued their banshee wail, a shrill counterpoint to the growing unease in my gut. I navigated through the labyrinthine aisles, the air growing colder, heavier, until I found myself in a section marked with a single, ominous symbol I vaguely recognized from obscure Vatican texts, a twisted knot of serpents devouring their own tails. It was here, amidst a collection of unmarked, leather-bound volumes, that I found it, a tome bound in something that felt like dried skin, its pages brittle parchment covered in elegant, alien script. Liber Sanguinis, the spine whispered in my mind, though no title was present. I'd only seen references to such a book in fragmented, apocryphal legends, a grimoire supposedly pennied by apostate priests after witnessing something unholy beneath St. Peter's Basilica centuries ago, later suppressed by the most extreme measures of the Holy See. I thought I was imagining it until my fingers traced the intricate calligraphy, and the Latin phrases began to coalesce into something coherent, something profoundly disturbing. Nomina non sunt nomina est claves. Names are not names, but keys. The words themselves felt like they were buzzing against my fingertips, carrying a subtle charge, a hint of something alive within the ink. This wasn't history, this was instruction. And it outlined rituals, invocations designed not to communicate with, but to compel entities from beyond the veil. Entities with names that were not to be spoken, only invoked. I should have known better, should have slammed the book shut and locked it away forever. The thudding from sublevel 7 intensified, a furious crescendo that seemed to vibrate in my very bones. No longer a random force, but a desperate plea, or perhaps a desperate demand. This sound cue, this relentless drumming, was no longer just the gates. It was something trying to claw its way into existence. My eyes scanned the brittle pages, absorbing the forbidden knowledge with a perverse fascination that curdled into genuine fear. The book detailed how these keys could unlock not just doors, but dimensions, how the very act of speaking certain phonemes could rend the fabric of reality. It spoke of the hunger, an ancient, formless void that desired only to consume, to expand, to make itself known. And within its final, blood-stained chapters, a series of names, each one more horrifying than the last, written in a script that seemed to shift and writhe before my eyes. Zylgoth, Mhrl, Cathar, unspeakable sounds that felt like blasphemies just to process in my thoughts. This wasn't merely a record, it was a weapon, a blueprint for disaster. Later, I would understand that these weren't merely names. They were the very essence of the entities, the pure distillation of their being, and merely knowing them was enough to begin a process of recognition. A cold dread seeped into my soul as I realized the implications. If this book contained such power, what else was hidden here, deep within the Vatican's unofficial, unacknowledged archives? What other forbidden texts, what other shattered prophecies lay waiting? The facility I'd been assigned to guard was not merely a containment site. It was a library of the apocalypse. The thudding stopped. The silence that followed was far worse than the noise, an immediate vacuum that sucked the air from the room, leaving only the frantic beat of my own heart. It was a silence that carried an expectation, a presence. I didn't realize then that the true escape wasn't through a breached gate, but through the mind. The knowledge I had just consumed, those whispered names, had carved a pathway directly into me. My psychological breakdown wasn't some external force. It was the slow, insidious rot from within, initiated by what I had seen, what I had read. The book was a virus, and I was its first victim in this long-dormant archive. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the facility's failing climate control, a shiver that traced the length of my spine and settled deep in my bones, as if something had just walked over my grave. Or, worse, walked into it. The lights flickered overhead, plunging the section into momentary darkness, then returning with a sickly yellow glow that seemed to accentuate the shadows. The air grew heavy with an unfamiliar scent, ozone and something else, something metallic and rotten, like old blood mixed with ozone. I clutched the book, a foolish instinct, as if its physical presence could protect me from the horrors it detailed. Then a low, guttural moan echoed from sublevel 7, not the metallic screech of tearing steel, but a sound that was wet, organic, and utterly, profoundly wrong. It was a sound that shouldn't exist, a sound that spoke of flesh and bone twisting into impossible configurations. This was not the alarm's fault. This was something reacting to me. My breath hitched. The alarm had stopped, but the horror had just begun. That was only the first mistake. The second was thinking I could ever unknow what I had just learned. Now I understand. The names weren't meant to be spoken by them. They were meant to be spoken by us. I should have stopped when I first saw the marginalia, the script that bled from the sanctioned text onto the virgin vellum, a secret language within the sacred. But I kept reading, didn't I? I always do. That insatiable hunger for the hidden, the forbidden. It's what led me to this facility, to these damned archives. I thought I was simply uncovering forgotten truths, unearthing the suppressed history of certain Vatican factions, those who knew that some knowledge is not merely power, but a living, breathing entity. When the power died, and the emergency lights flickered on, painting the sterile corridors in a sickly, jaundiced glow, I remember thinking, this is it. They know I've found it. But the alarms, God help me, they began before I cut the main conduit. A shrill, banshee wail that tore through the very concrete, shaking my teeth. A sound that bypassed the ear and resonated directly in the marrow of my bones. I didn't realize then that cutting the power was merely an invitation, not a solution, that the true source of the dread was already awake, already feeding. The darkness, when it came fully, was absolute, suffocating, a blanket woven from the very fabric of the abysses. My flashlight beam became a trembling, solitary spear against an ocean of dread. The sirens, however, thrived in it. They didn't die, they changed. The piercing blare gave way to a multi-layered cacophony, a chorus of dissonant tones that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere. It was a sound designed not to alert, but to unravel. Each throb was a question posed directly to my sanity. I traced the sound, moving through the labyrinthine passages, my hand scraping against the cold, sweating walls, the air thick with the metallic tang of fear and something else, something cloying and ancient. My breath hitched in my throat as I stumbled upon the first panel. It wasn't an emergency lighting fixture, nor a standard control panel. It was a slab of obsidian-like material, humming with an internal violet light that pulsed with symbols I wasn't trained to read, but instantly recognized from the Codex Arcana I'd spent weeks deciphering, the very book that should have remained locked away, hidden from human eyes. The symbols writhed, shifting like living things, not static glyphs, but a dynamic language of impossible geometry and non-Euclidean angles. They felt like keys, like mechanisms, To what? To where? My radio, usually a dead channel in these lower levels, crackled to life, hissing with static. Then came the voices. Not the terse, clipped calls of security personnel, not the panicked shouts of trapped researchers. These voices were a distorted chorus, whispers like sandpaper, rising and falling with the rhythm of the pulsing cymbals. They spoke in tongues, in fragments of Latin and something far older, a guttural rasp that seemed to vibrate from within my own chest. Preceptor fracta, porti apati, they rasped, over and over, phrases from the very texts I'd been studying, phrases that warned of transgressions and consequences. I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach, the kind that whispers of irrevocable mistakes. These were not guards. These were the guardians of something far worse, or perhaps the things they guarded. I tried to raise command, my thumb trembling on the transmit button, but the only response was a fresh wave of static, laced with what sounded like muffled cries, and then a chillingly clear whisper that cut through the din. To Cognis, you know. It was aimed at me directly, personally. My blood ran cold. The pulsing panels led me deeper, the alarms now a relentless, undulating drone, a pulse in the very infrastructure of this place. I kept walking, driven by a perverse need to understand, to witness the full scope of my desecration. I thought I was imagining it at first, the way the whispers seemed to coalesce, to form words, names even. My own name, my full name, the name only my family uses, a name that should have no resonance in these desolate, forbidden halls. That was the first spike of true, unadulterated horror, the realization that this wasn't just an institutional breakdown, it was a personal invasion. Air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence, a pressure on my skin. I could feel eyes in the darkness, not human eyes, but something ancient, something that had waited centuries in the shadows. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, pulling me towards the cell blocks, the deepest, most secure section of this facility, where the unspeakable was kept locked away. Or so I was told. The very thought, the possibility that these beings were here, now, outside their cells, was enough to make my stomach churn. My flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing the heavy, reinforced doors of the cells, rows upon rows of them, each one a tomb. But it was not silence that greeted me from within. It was a cacophony of sound, a dreadful symphony of cries and pleas, a chorus of voices that shouldn't exist, voices that twisted the knife of my burgeoning insanity. They weren't the shrieks of deranged inmates. They were familiar, too familiar. Brother, help me, please, it hurts. That was David, my younger brother, his voice cracking with the terror I remembered from our childhood nightmares. Then soft, maternal, yet laced with an unearthly echo. My son, why have you done this? You broke the seals. My mother. Her gentle tone, now a venomous accusation. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This couldn't be real. It was a trick, a psychological assault designed to break me, to exploit my deepest guilt. But the dread was too visceral, the voices too perfect, too devastatingly theirs. I stumbled back, my mind racing, trying to reconcile the impossibility of it all. How could they know these voices? How could they replicate them with such chilling accuracy? The pulsing light from the obsidian panels now seemed to mock me, illuminating the cold, hard reality that my academic curiosity had opened a door to a darkness I could never comprehend, let alone close. The Vatican conspiracies, the forbidden books I'd unearthed, the names that summoned, the shadowy rituals I'd read about, they weren't merely theoretical constructs from dusty tomes. They were here, alive, manifesting themselves in the most agonizing way imaginable. My hands shook so violently I nearly dropped the flashlight. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to run, to flee this cursed place, but my feet were rooted. I was caught in a trap of my own making, an intellectual predator now preyed upon by something far older, far more cunning than any human mind. I felt a profound, sickening understanding dawn upon me. This wasn't just a place of containment, it was a gateway, and I, in my arrogance, had just helped pry it open. The whispered accusations from the cells continued, multiplying, overlapping, forming a monstrous mosaic of my past, my regrets, my deepest fears. Each voice, each familiar intonation, was a nail driven into my psychological coffin. You thought you could understand us, little scholar. You thought you could read our language without consequence. The voice was deep, resonant, ancient, and it was no longer trying to sound like anyone I knew. It was the source, the architect of this torment. I had breached the sacred, defied the warnings, and now the things I had sought to understand were turning the tables, dissecting me. My mind teetered on the precipice, a vast, black chasm opening up beneath me, ready to swallow what little sanity I had left. I had broken the sacred silence, and in return, the silence of my own soul was shattered forever. I stand here in the echoing darkness, the alarms still screaming, the voices of my family still pleading and accusing from unseen cells, and I wonder which of us is truly the inmate now. I've always known the archives held secrets, ancient truths carefully sequestered from the profane gaze. My work as a cataloger, a guardian of forgotten texts, taught me the meticulous order designed to contain chaos. But some knowledge isn't merely secret, it's forbidden, a disease of the mind. My mistake wasn't just finding cell 19, it was allowing myself to see it, to break the unwritten code that guards against such abominations. The very air in that section of the Sub-Vatican archives feels heavier, thicker, a palpable weight of unholy information pressing down, a constant thrum beneath my perception. I feel it even now, a phantom pressure behind my eyes. Every wing, every corridor of this sprawling labyrinth has its files. Each cell, each sealed chamber is accounted for, cross-referenced, its contents logged with scrupulous, almost obsessive detail. But cell 19, it simply wasn't there. No entry in the main ledger, no transfer date, no name, no purpose. It occupied a physical space in the most restricted wing, tucked away behind a rusted iron door, yet it was a ghost in the system, a profound, chilling lacuna in an otherwise perfect record. This absence was the first anomaly, the first crack in my carefully constructed reality. It should have been my cue to turn back, to ignore the gnawing curiosity that pricked at the back of my neck. But I kept going. The door, despite its age and a thick patina of rust, swung open with an unnerving ease, not quite silent, but without the expected protest of long unused hinges. The silence beyond it was absolute, absorbing even the faint hum of ancient air filtration units from the main halls. The cell was small, Spartan, a cube of unadorned stone. Yet the lock, a formidable mechanism of wrought iron, was unlatched and stood ajar. It hadn't been forced. It had been opened from the inside, and when my hand, trembling slightly, brushed against the rough-hewn stone of the doorframe, a wave of distinct heat pulsed through my fingertips, like a breath, warm and impossibly close. I didn't realize then that the residual heat wasn't just a sign of recent departure, but a lingering presence, a sentience. The walls were scarred, not just with the grime of ages, but with markings. A chaotic, desperate tapestry of lines and symbols etched deeply into the stone. They looked like they had been carved by fingernails, by something with sharp, desperate talons, over and over, until the rock surrendered. It was a cacophony of madness, a primal scream rendered in stone. My academic mind, trained to decipher ancient scripts, tried to make sense of the patterns, searching for a recognizable glyph, a known dialect, anything to ground this unsettling scene in the familiar. I found nothing. I should have walked away, should have sealed the door and reported the anomaly. But the carvings held me, a morbid fascination taking root, deepening with every passing second. And then it began. Slowly at first, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift. The individual scratches, the frantic lines, started to undulate, to flow like liquid shadows across the rough surface of the wall. They rearranged themselves, coalescing, morphing from arbitrary marks into precise, horrifying characters. And as they formed, it became sickeningly clear. These weren't just random symbols. They were letters, a script, and what made my blood run cold was that they were arranging themselves into something only I could read. A language I had only ever encountered in forbidden grimoires, in texts whispered about in hushed tones by scholars who valued their sanity. It was Latin, but warped, corrupted, interwoven with symbols that pulsed with an internal, unseen light. A dialect of desperation, a plea and a curse, woven into a name. The true name, nomina vera, of something ancient, something that dwells in the liminal spaces between thought and being. It spoke of cycles, of rituals performed under the gaze of stars that are not in our sky. It detailed the necessary ingredients for calling forth entities that lie beyond the veil, not from the realm of the divine, but from the abyssal, outer darkness. Vatican conspiracies suddenly felt less like abstract theories and more like desperate, last-ditch defenses against this exact kind of revelation. I felt a cold, tendrilled touch inside my skull, a silent whisper that wasn't a sound but an impression, a transfer of knowing. A single, resonant syllable echoed within the hollow chambers of my mind, a name that felt too heavy, too potent to be merely a word. It was a key, a summoning, and simply by perceiving it, I had activated something. I thought I was imagining it, the phantom sensation of a presence growing behind me, a static charge in the air, until the very stone of the cell seemed to vibrate, a low, resonant thrumming that began in my bones and threatened to shatter my teeth. The atmosphere thickened, growing dense and suffocating, pushing against my lungs. That was only the first mistake. Later, I would understand that those weren't just carvings. They were anchors, a desperate attempt to contain or to communicate, and by reading them, I had undone whatever tenuous balance existed. The knowledge didn't just enter my mind. It rooted itself there, a parasitic growth that now thrives on my fear. The names, the rituals, the dreadful truths about the spaces between worlds, they are now a part of me, burning beneath my skin. I feel eyes on me always, a weight in the peripheral vision, a knowing presence that follows, always just out of sight, just beyond earshot, but undeniably there. Now the world feels thinner, permeable. I catch glimpses of things in reflections, distortions in shadow, shapes that flicker at the edge of my sanity. The whispers that started in cell 19 never truly left. They accompany me, a constant, insidious chorus of forgotten tongues, urging me, tempting me, sometimes threatening me with truths I never wanted to hear. My sleep is a battlefield of fractured visions and oppressive dread. I am no longer just an archivist. I am a vessel, a repository for a knowledge that poisons everything it touches. And I know, with every fiber of my being, that cell 19 was not empty because its occupant had left, but because it had found a new, more expansive prison, me. I should have let the anomaly remain unexamined, the ghost cell a mere systemic error, but now the error is within me, and there is no escape. I broke the protocols, slipped past the automated sensors that hummed with a lethargic, ancient power, and found my way into Section Gamma. It was foolish, of course, an academic curiosity that curdled into a feverish obsession. I should have stopped when the air grew heavy, thick with the dust of centuries, and the unspoken warnings of every man who had ever vanished trying to decipher what was never meant to be known. But I kept reading, tracing the intricate script of the Codex Vacuus, a lexicon of fractured realities, and what it called echoes. Its pages were brittle, reeking of ozone, and something akin to burnt copper, detailing names that weren't names but sonic keys, phrases that promised not power but dissolution. My initial research was innocent enough, or so I told myself. A deep dive into apocryphal Vatican conspiracies, the ones whispered in hushed tones behind lead-lined doors. I was looking for patterns, for anomalies in the records of the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, for the gaps where knowledge had been surgically removed. What I found instead was a detailed account, almost a how-to guide, on the manifestation of temporal anomalies, of doppelgangers not as spectral apparitions, but as physical divergences, solid and breathing. It spoke of a thinning of the veil, where one's own perception could become unreliable, where the self could be duplicated, displaced, or even replaced entirely. I thought I was imagining it until the first glitch in the security feed. The control room was my sanctuary, a place of ordered grids and predictable movements, or so it had been. I was reviewing the overnight patrols, a standard procedure, when the monitor assigned to Corridor 7 suddenly flickered. It wasn't a common signal drop, not a routine static burst. For a split second, the image distorted, not into white noise, but into a different scene entirely. I saw myself, or rather, a figure that was undeniably me, standing at the junction of Corridor 12, a section of the facility I hadn't entered in weeks, my back to the camera, illuminated by the harsh, unflattering fluorescent hum. My heart gave a strange, sickening lurch. That was only the first mistake, the first subtle tremor of the ground beneath my feet. Next morning, the supervisor's voice crackled through the intercom, his tone laced with an impatience that felt alien. Codex, report to Quadrant Delta immediately. We've got a system anomaly in sublevel 3. I froze. Quadrant Delta didn't exist. Not on the blueprints, not in the architectural schematics, not anywhere within this facility's known layout. I checked the schematics again, my fingers trembling as I scrolled through the digital maps, cross-referencing against the aged paper plans. Nothing. It was a phantom designation, a ghost location. Yet his voice had been so authoritative, so utterly convinced. I didn't realize then that the flickering of the old CRT wasn't a malfunction, but a window into a place I was supposed to be, a reality that was beginning to assert itself over my own. The paranoia began to set in, a cold seep into my very bones. Was he testing me? Was this some elaborate psychological evaluation for my illicit archive access? But the urgency in his voice, the genuine frustration, suggested otherwise. It was as if he was experiencing a different version of this facility, a version where Quadrant Delta was as real as the polished concrete beneath my boots. Later, I would understand that the Codex Vacuus wasn't merely a record of these phenomena. It was a catalyst. Each reading, each whispered transliteration of the sonic keys amplified the instability, inviting the echoes closer. The camera feed incidents became more frequent, more brazen. I would watch myself, or this other self, navigating corridors that twisted into impossible angles, past doorways that led to sheer brick walls in my own reality. It was like watching a film of my own life, but a director had reshot certain scenes with a different actor, a parallel script. Then came the moment that shattered whatever fragile hold I had on my sanity. It was during my scheduled security rounds, a monotonous circuit through the lower levels. As I passed a particularly isolated surveillance camera, one I knew was active and beaming directly to the control room, I saw it. On the monitor, the figure that was me, or looked exactly like me, was already there, waiting. It stood perfectly still, directly in the camera's field of view, its head slowly tilting, looking directly into the lens, into my eyes through the screen. Its lips moved, forming silent, deliberate words. The language was guttural, ancient, a series of clicks and sibilants that I had never heard, yet somehow in the deepest, most primal part of my being, it felt vaguely familiar, like a half-forgotten dream or the echo of a nightmare yet to manifest. It was speaking the sonic keys from the Codex Vacuus, I realized with a sick lurch of recognition, the very incantations I had been reading, the ones that summoned this. The silent, mouthing horror on the screen was my echo, a divergent self born from forbidden knowledge, and it was acknowledging me. It was inviting me. My supervisor's voice blared through the internal comms again. Codex, are you at checkpoint 9? The sensors show you've been stationary for over 2 minutes. Report. Checkpoint 9 was nowhere near where I was. It was located on level B4, a level I hadn't approached that entire day. He was seeing me, the other me, standing still, staring into the camera. He was seeing it. I tried to respond, to explain, but my throat was dry, constricted by a fear so profound it bordered on paralysis. The words caught, stuck somewhere between my burning lungs and my chattering teeth. I stumbled away from the monitor, away from the silent accusation of my double. The implications were catastrophic. If I was here, then who was he talking to? Who was walking through checkpoint 9, registering on the sensors, fulfilling the duties of my shift? And if I was not where I thought I was, then who was walking in my body, staring into a camera with a silent, terrible message meant only for me? The reality was twisting, fraying at the edges, and I was losing my grip. Each passing moment was a terrifying confirmation that my presence here, in this physical space, was becoming optional, negotiable. Now every shadow holds a potential mirror, every reflection a silent question. I check the cameras constantly, a frantic, desperate vigil, searching for myself, searching for him. The double has become bolder, appearing in more footage, sometimes just a fleeting glimpse in a distant corridor, sometimes unnervingly close, performing mundane tasks with an unsettling precision, a mockery of my own existence. I see myself, but it isn't me. It's an empty vessel, animated by something I unwittingly unleashed, mouthing terrible truths into a world that refuses to see. The silence of his spoken words is deafening, a constant reminder of the breach, the irreparable damage. I read the forbidden words, and now I'm caught in their consequence, unable to discern which reality is mine, or if any of them truly are. The first rule, drilled into every initiate of the Vatican archives, was never to speak the names aloud, never to transcribe them without protective sigils, and never to dwell too long on their inherent resonance. I broke every single one of those rules, not out of malice, but out of a desperate, academic curiosity that has now curdled into a cold, ceaseless dread that wraps itself around my very marrow. I should have stopped when the ink on the ancient parchment seemed to shimmer, when the room's ambient hum shifted, but I kept reading, tracing the contours of forgotten glyphs that promised profound, if terrible, truths. My work had led me deep into the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, not merely as a list of banned books, but as a catalogue of warnings, a compendium of texts deemed too dangerous to exist, not for heresy alone, but for their inherent power. I was sifting through the Codex Maleficorum Scriptorum, a medieval grimoire supposedly expunged, its pages filled with what appeared to be a linguistic system that predated all known tongues. It described entities, not as gods or demons, but as frequencies, as resonant patterns, each with its own sigil personales, a unique vibrational signature. I didn't realize then that these weren't merely theoretical constructs. They were active, alive. These weren't names in the traditional sense, but complex numerical and tonal sequences designed to resonate with specific energies. The texts hinted at a clandestine Vatican arm, ancient and shadow-bound, that had always sought to contain and categorize these entities, and more disturbingly, to understand their methods of identification, how they singled out individuals. This was the first open loop, the initial thread of fear. If they could identify, could they also possess? I dismissed it as historical paranoia, academic sensationalism, a relic of a more superstitious age. I was assigned to this facility shortly after my controversial findings, ostensibly to organize the patient files, a sterile euphemism for processing the human detritus of forgotten experiments and arcane afflictions. The hushed corridors, the rhythmic drone of the ventilation system, the distant, muffled cries of the unstable. It all formed a disconcerting backdrop to my clinical work. But the texts, the forbidden law, they clung to me like a second skin, a constant whisper behind my thoughts, connecting the ancient conspiracies to the very palpable disquiet of my new environment. And then I started noticing patterns, almost imperceptible at first. A tremor in the air when certain files were opened, a brief, high-pitched hum that no one else seemed to hear. The patients, often sedated into stupor, would sometimes stir, their eyes flickering with an intelligence too keen for their supposed state, too ancient. I thought I was imagining it, a side effect of too many hours spent poring over forbidden lore, but the feeling of being watched intensified, a cold prickle on the back of my neck that defied logical explanation. It was as if the pages themselves had followed me, their dread-soaked knowledge now bleeding into the very fabric of this place. I distinctly recall the moment the transition began, the subtle shift from clinical observation to abject terror. It was late, past midnight, the facility wrapped in its usual pall of artificial quiet. I was reviewing the psychiatric evaluations of patient 734, a man who spoke only in rhythmic, guttural clicks and hums, when a soft, almost imperceptible sound started. It wasn't a scream nor a groan. It was a repetitive, low-frequency vocalization emanating from cell block gamma where the most severely afflicted were housed. A single, distinct syllable repeated, then another, then a third. A pattern. My heart hammered against my ribs. The pattern, a series of three seemingly random numbers, resonated with a sequence I had painstakingly transcribed from the Liber Resonantiae, a text detailing the vibrational signatures of objects and persons. I didn't realize then that the texts were not merely describing a system, but activating it, turning my academic pursuits into a direct, terrifying conduit. The sound paused, then intensified, joined by another voice. And then another, the syllables multiplying, echoing, building into an unbearable chorus. The chanting began, a low, guttural murmur at first, then rising, swelling, filling the sterile air of the facility. It wasn't random. It was a series of numbers, three numbers. My mind, trained to dissect and analyze, tried to assign meaning, to find a pattern, but my conscious thought was immediately eclipsed by a cold wave of recognition. It was my badge number. The three digits assigned to me upon my arrival, printed on the laminated plastic hanging from my neck. The unique identifier that marked me as an authorized presence, now weaponized, chanted by the very inmates I was meant to observe. Started from cell block Gamma, then spread to Delta, then Epsilon. The voices were varied, deep, reedy, adolescent, ancient, a chorus of madness that somehow achieved perfect, horrifying unison. 279er, they intoned over and over, their voices devoid of any human inflection, flat and resonant, like stones grinding against each other. Even the ones supposedly in a chemical coma, lying still and unresponsive for months, stirred, their lips moving, forming the terrifying litany. I pressed my palms to my ears, hard, desperate to block out the sound, but it was useless. The sound wasn't in the air. It was inside my skull, resonating with something deep within my own being, twisting my perception. This wasn't merely an auditory hallucination. It was an invasion, a violation. It was the moment I realized the Vatican's warnings weren't about protecting humanity from abstract horrors, but about protecting individuals from becoming known to them. The sigil personalis wasn't just an ancient identifier. It was a key, and I had foolishly provided my own by simply existing within these walls, perhaps even by studying the very mechanisms of its activation. My badge number, a mundane administrative detail, had become my curse, a beacon in the darkness for something I still couldn't comprehend. I should have stopped when I first felt the tremor in the pages of the Verbum Exsanguis, when the cold touch on my wrist mimicked the ancient, warning glyph for recognition. But I kept reading, convinced that knowledge was my shield. Now it was clear that knowledge, particularly of this forbidden sort, was merely a conduit. The chanting was not an act of aggression. It was an acknowledgement. They knew me. This place, these entities, whatever forces animated these broken men and women, they knew me better than I knew myself, down to the very numerical sequence that defined my presence. And there was no escape. The echoes of 279er still reverberate, not just in the walls of this damned facility, but in the deepest, most terrified chambers of my own consciousness. And I am merely a number now, waiting for the true reckoning. I know now that I should have never crossed that threshold, should have turned my back on the silence that hung so heavy in the warden's office, thicker than any fog. It was a violation, perhaps, but the pull was undeniable, an insidious whisper against the dull drone of the emergency generators. The chair was overturned. A ceramic mug lay shattered on the floor, its coffee long since congealed into a dark, syrupy stain. Yet, on the otherwise pristine surface of the mahogany desk, sat the book, alone. Utterly out of place, considering the chaotic tableau surrounding it, almost reverent in its solitary vigil. I didn't realize then that this was the moment the door truly opened, not to a room, but to an abyss. It wasn't the book I knew, not the familiar, comforting weight of scripture. The leather cover was too dark, too supple, almost slick to the touch, and it seemed to absorb the meager light from the single bare bulb above. A faint, cloying scent, like old parchment and dried blood, emanated from its closed pages. I should have stopped when I saw the binding, an intricate pattern of interlacing serpents that seemed to writhe even under my gaze, each scale etched with tiny, almost imperceptible Latin script. But I kept reaching, a moth to a flame, drawn by a curiosity that felt less like my own, more like a compulsion born of the prison's suffocating dread. My fingers brushed against the cover, and a shiver, cold and precise, traced its way up my arm. The room, already quiet, seemed to press in closer, every shadow deepening, every creak of the old building amplified. I found myself holding my breath, my own heartbeat roaring in my ears like a distant drum. This wasn't just a book. It was a key, I instinctively knew, to something buried deep beneath the foundations of this place, something the Vatican had tried to suppress for centuries. An open loop, a dark invitation that promised more than just knowledge. The moment I opened it, the silence shattered, not with a sound from outside, but from within the very structure of the prison. A low, guttural groan vibrated through the floorboards, a sound too organic for concrete and steel, like the building itself was a living thing, stirring from a long, tormented sleep. Inside, the pages were wrong. Half the book was missing, replaced by sheets of parchment, brittle and yellowed, covered in frantic, looping handwriting that crawled across the vellum like agitated insects. The ink was faded, some parts almost illegible, but the sheer volume of text hinted at a desperate, monumental effort. I found myself reading, compelled, my eyes tracing the lines, even as a warning bell screamed somewhere deep in my subconscious. These weren't psalms or proverbs. They were incantations, references to obscure, forbidden rituals, to entities that shouldn't have names, let alone be invoked. The language was a twisted hybrid of archaic Latin and something far older, far more unsettling, speaking of umbra and sanguis, of the veil between, and the crimson pact. I thought I was imagining it until I saw it, stark against the parchment, etched between two lines of a passage that detailed the unbinding of the soul's true name, my name. Not just my common name, but a hidden, forgotten one, a patronymic whispered only once at my baptism, erased from all official records by my family, who held their own secretive beliefs. This was no coincidence. A cold, creeping dread began to solidify in my gut, solidifying into a block of ice. The warden hadn't merely disappeared. He had become entangled, perhaps willingly, in this ancient tapestry of fear. This wasn't a manual. It was a testament, a confession, a ritualistic log written in the warden's frantic hand, chronicling his descent into something unspeakable. It spoke of guardians and wardens, not of men with badges and keys, but of custodians of far older, darker secrets, tethered to the very stones of such places. This prison, I began to understand, was not merely a place of incarceration, but a locus, a carefully constructed cage for something beyond mortal comprehension, and the warden had been its unwilling priest, or perhaps its final sacrifice. Later I would understand that his coffee, still steaming when it was cold, was not a trick of the mind. I should have closed the book, should have run, but my fingers felt glued to the parchment, my eyes locked on the maddening script. The groaning of the prison intensified, morphing into a low hum that vibrated in my bones, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It was a lament, a protest, or perhaps an awakening. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of ozone and something metallic, like stale blood. My head began to throb, a rhythmic pulse in my temples mirroring the building's ominous heartbeat. My vision blurred at the edges, the frantic script seeming to swim before my eyes, each letter taking on a life of its own, twisting into grotesque forms that whispered unspeakable promises. The text spoke of an awakening of the true self through the severance of the mundane, a path that required not just sacrifice, but a willingness to see beyond the fabricated light. It mentioned the silent watchers of the void, entities that fed on despair and forgotten histories, drawn by the reverberations of certain names, certain words. And my name, my secret name, was among them. This was no ordinary conspiracy. It was a cosmic horror, cloaked in ecclesiastical robes, a forbidden knowledge meticulously hidden by the highest echelons of power, by those who knew the names, by those who knew what they could summon. My initial fascination had curdled into pure, unadulterated terror. I felt its tendrils, not just of ink and parchment, but of pure, ancient dread, beginning to coil around my own sanity, weaving itself into the very fabric of my thoughts. The lines between what was real and what the book conjured began to blur. The warden's madness, documented so meticulously in these pages, was now a shared inheritance, a contagion. I could feel the prison's breath on my neck, a cold, stale exhalation that carried the echoes of countless tortured souls. The pages seemed to glow faintly, pulsing with a malevolent energy, and I knew with absolute certainty that reading my name within its cursed text was the irreversible step, the breaking of a sacred seal. This was only the first mistake. The book now felt like an extension of my own body, its morbid contents seeping directly into my mind, rewriting the rules of my reality. I no longer just read the words. I felt their vibrations, heard their guttural pronouncements in the deep, resonant groans of the prison walls. My vision started to swim with shadowy figures darting at the periphery, just outside the direct light, just beyond the edge of perception. They were not there, and yet they were everywhere. The room felt colder, the air thinner, as if something vast and hungry had just drawn a deep, slow breath, waiting. I couldn't close it, not now. The words had taken root, the rituals begun. I am trapped, not within these walls, but within the dreadful knowledge this accursed book unleashed. I should never have sought the Codex Umbrarum. The forbidden knowledge it contained was a poison, a corrosive truth that has since eaten away at the very foundations of my reality. My initial transgression was one of pure academic hubris, a belief that the arcane wards and papal edicts were merely archaic superstitions, not warnings carved in blood. I remember the chill of the unlit crypt below the Vatican's deepest archives, the scent of damp earth and ancient incense. That was only the first mistake. Now, trapped in this labyrinth of my own making, the cold dread is a constant companion, a breath on the back of my neck, even when no one is there. The facility I was brought to ostensibly for debriefing after my unauthorized access was supposed to be a secure, sterile environment. Concrete, steel, anodyne fluorescent lights. A prison, yes, but one of predictable dimensions. I kept the codex hidden, its weight a physical anchor in my pocket, a constant reminder of the breach. For the first few days, the familiar geometry of the corridors was a comfort, a bulwark against the unsettling revelations I'd gleaned from the book's vellum pages. I read of the architecti caligo, the shadow architects, whispered to have shaped the earliest, blasphemous structures of man, bending space as a sculptor bends clay. I thought it was metaphorical, an allegory for corruption. I thought I was imagining it until the first door refused to open onto the chamber it was meant to. It started subtly. A corridor felt longer one day, shorter the next. A junction I had navigated dozens of times suddenly presented a new, third path, barely discernible in the dim light. My maps, meticulously drawn from memory, began to contradict the physical space around me. I trace a route, confident in its path, only to find myself at an entirely different wing, a section of the facility that, according to official blueprints, didn't exist. I would stand there, my flashlight beam cutting through the oppressive gloom, illuminating walls that shimmered with an unsettling, almost liquid quality. This place was not static. It was alive or being made to live. Every creak, every groan of the ancient pipes sounds like the building itself breathing around me. Non omnis mora, I used to tell myself, repeating the old Latin adage like a prayer, but now the walls seemed to whisper it back, mocking me. I began carving marks into the concrete, crude arrows pointing towards what I believed was the exit, or at least a known point. But when I circled back, sometimes hours later, sometimes what felt like days, those arrows had rotated. They pointed at me, or towards new, impossible angles, sometimes even seeming to point into the solid wall itself. The very matter of this prison was shifting, remaking itself around me, often when I wasn't looking, like a malevolent, silent guardian playing a cruel game. It wasn't the guards I feared anymore. It was the architecture, the sheer, crushing impossibility of it all. The Codex describes it, this geometria obscura, the forbidden art of spatial manipulation. I thought it was historical, a forgotten sin. But here now, I was living inside its pages. The dread has become a physical thing, a constant pressure behind my eyes. I can feel the tremors in the floorboards now, subtle, almost imperceptible shifts that precede the larger, more terrifying changes. Sometimes I hear faint, rhythmic thuds echoing from deep within the walls, like a giant heart beating or something being dragged. And then there are the whispers. They aren't words, not exactly, but a low, guttural murmur that seems to emanate from the very stone itself. Is it the building? Or is it the entity that the Codex hints at, the one summoned by names too terrible to utter, the true architect of this blasphemous expansion? I didn't realize then that merely reading the names, even in their encrypted form, could be an act of invocation. The pages of the Codex now reflect the changes, its ancient diagrams morphing to depict the very corridors I navigate. Where once there was an illustration of a labyrinthine Roman catacomb, there is now an impossible diagram of this facility, with hallways splitting into angles that defy Euclidean geometry. Doors lead back to themselves, forming maddening loops. My flashlight beam, once a beacon, now seems to bend and warp in these black corners, swallowed by non-existent shadows that weren't there hours ago. The paper is no longer just paper. It is a living map of my personal hell. I remember reading about the concept of liminalitas aeterna in the book, the eternal threshold, a space that is perpetually in transition, neither here nor there, designed to break the will and mind of any who dared to cross its borders. I had scoffed at such archaic terrors. Now I understand. I am living in that liminal space, and it is slowly devouring me. My supplies are dwindling, my sense of time is shattered, and the lines between reality and nightmare blur with each passing shift of the walls. I see faces in the patterns of damp mold, hear my name whispered by the rattling pipes. This isn't a prison, it's a living trap closing in. I have found chambers that defy logic, a vast, echoing cavern where a library should be, filled with crumbling, unspeakable tomes, not one of which was there yesterday. And in one such chamber, just as the walls seemed to stretch and twist like wet clay, I saw a movement in the periphery, a fleeting, angular shadow that did not belong to any natural creature. It was too tall, too thin, too wrong. It glided along the newly formed seam in the concrete, a seam that had not existed moments before, and then vanished as if absorbed by the wall itself. I should have stopped when the first illustration in the marginalia seemed to writhe, but I kept reading, believing myself immune to its insidious influence. I was a fool, a self-important scholar chasing shadows. Now the shadows chase me. The building is not just changing. It is expanding, consuming, becoming something utterly vast and incomprehensible. And I am its prisoner, a fly caught in the web of a colossal, unseen spider. I trace the strange symbols on the pages of the Codex, the glyphs of the Architecti Caligo, wondering if they are the key to escape or merely deeper traps. My reflection in a puddle of stagnant water shows a gaunt, wild-eyed stranger, a man who has looked too long into the abyss. And the abyss, I fear, has finally looked back and found a new home. The walls are not merely walls anymore. They are the membrane of something hungry, and I am already inside. The first mistake was not dismissing the whispers, the faint, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to emanate from the very stone of the Archivum Secretum itself. It was the thrill of the forbidden, the intoxicating lure of knowledge that led me deeper than any scholar should ever venture, past the sanctioned sections, beyond the gilded cages of documented heresy, into the true non-licit, the unpermitted. I told myself I was merely categorizing, verifying the provenance of the Codex Gigas, fragments the Curia thought securely locked away. But my true purpose was far darker, driven by the cryptic allusions found within the newly rediscovered Liber Ignis, a text deemed too dangerous even for the index. I should have stopped when I first deciphered the oblique references to the mirror prison of the self. But the academic in me, the seeker of truth, was a fool. I felt a subtle shift in the air, a drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the ancient masonry's chill, as if I had stepped through an unseen veil. My research had led me to a sub-basement, an unmapped catacomb beneath the Vatican Library, forgotten by all but the dust and whatever ancient entities had carved its existence. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and something metallic, like stale blood or rust. It was here, at the end of a long, narrow corridor, carved not from brick, but from some obsidian-like stone that seemed to drink the light, that I saw it. A door. No handle, no visible hinges, just a seamless, dark surface that pulsed with a faint, internal crimson glow, beating like a captured heart. What part of me, I wonder now, was already calling to it, even then? I traced the pulsating outline, my fingers brushing against the cold, smooth stone. The red light intensified with each beat, casting grotesque, shifting shadows that danced like phantoms along the corridor walls. It wasn't a steady light. It was a rhythmic throb, a silent thrum that vibrated through the floorboards and up into my very bones. The silence of the archives, usually a comforting blanket, now felt like a suffocating shroud, amplifying the unnatural rhythm. I didn't realize then that the true horror wasn't in the visual spectacle, but in its profound, insidious resonance with my own hidden anxieties, a frequency I couldn't yet identify, but one that was already beginning to dismantle my sense of self. Then I heard it, a sound faint at first, barely a whisper from behind the door. It was a low moan, a desperate sob, and then a distinct, undeniable plea. My blood ran cold, turning to icy slush in my veins. It was my voice. Not an echo, not a hallucination, but the exact timbre, the precise inflection of my own speech, laced with an agony I had never known. Please. Let me out, it begged. A raw, choking whisper that pierced the oppressive silence, a perfect imitation of my most vulnerable cadence. I pressed my ear against the pulsating stone, my heart hammering against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat drowning out everything else. The voice grew clearer, closer, a mirror of my own internal monologue exposed. It was recounting things, dredging up memories I had meticulously buried, sins I had convinced myself I'd forgotten, regrets that were meant to die with me. The promise broken to Mother, it rasped. The betrayal of Marcus, the secrets kept from Elena. Each word was a sharpened shard of glass, twisting in wounds I thought long healed. Who knew these things? Who else could possibly articulate the precise, crippling weight of my guilt? That was the moment I realized this wasn't merely an echo or some dark illusion. This was personal, terrifyingly so, and inextricably linked to my very essence. Panic seized me, a cold, clawing hand tightening around my throat. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet, the sound of my scrambling footsteps echoing unnaturally in the confined space. My rational mind screamed for an explanation, a recording, a trick of acoustics. But the emotion, the sheer unbearable knowledge in the voice, shattered any logical defenses. It knew my fears not just conceptually, but intimately, as if it had lived them. Later, I would understand that it had lived them through me. Against every instinct, against the primal urge to flee, an unholy curiosity, born of pure dread, compelled me forward. I had to know. I stretched out a trembling hand, reaching for where a door handle should be, a point on the seamless surface where the crimson light seemed to pulse most intensely. My fingers made contact, and a shock of paradoxical sensation coursed through me. It burned, searing hot, yet felt like the deepest, most agonizing frostbite. It was a pain that didn't just hurt my skin. It seemed to penetrate directly into my spirit, a cold fire that threatened to consume my very consciousness. My hand recoiled violently, leaving a phantom ache that still lingers. The voice inside my voice shifted its tone. The begging turned into a low, mocking chuckle, then back to a pleading whine, a terrifying symphony of psychological torment. You came back, it whispered, the words slithering into my mind, not just heard by my ears, but resonating within my skull. You always do. You want to know, don't you? What is it like in here? What did you leave behind? It was no longer just begging for release. It was taunting me, inviting me into a terror I couldn't yet grasp. This was not a simple prison. It was a crucible, and something of me was being forged, or perhaps unmade, within. I pressed myself against the opposing wall, gasping for air that suddenly felt thin and acrid. The pulsing red light continued its rhythmic beat, the voice inside growing bolder, weaving a tapestry of my failures, my inadequacies, my hidden desires. It spoke of the research, the librignes, and the names I had learned, forbidden names I had only dared to whisper in the sterile confines of my mind, like Abraxas and Zaphon. Names I now realized were keys, not merely labels. This was the moment the unraveling truly began, when the line between observer and participant, between pursuer and prey, irrevocably blurred, and I understood with a chilling certainty that the door wasn't keeping something in, it was keeping something from me. The realization struck me with the force of a physical blow. If that wasn't me trapped behind the door, then what part of me had already escaped? My breath hitched, and I scrambled backward again, a desperate, animal instinct urging me away from the impossible chamber. But the echoes of my own voice, mocking, weeping, damning, followed me, imprinting themselves onto the very fabric of my being, whispering promises of a terrifying reunion I now knew was inevitable. My sanity, I could feel it, was already a frayed thread. And I know, with every fiber of my being, that it's still there, waiting, still pulsing with that malevolent crimson light, and still calling to me in my own voice. I crossed a line I was explicitly warned against. Not a physical boundary, but a conceptual one, drawn by centuries of papal decree and the hushed warnings of men who looked like they'd seen hell, men who spoke of the sacra damnata in hushed, trembling tones. My assignment here, in this facility buried beneath the Apennines, was ostensibly containment, a penitent, monastic vigil guarding what the Church deemed too blasphemous for any living soul to encounter. I was an archivist, given a rifle and a set of keys, told to catalogue the detainees through their effects, through the historical records that followed them, never to actually see them. A guard, yes, but a scholar first. I remember thinking, foolishly, that my intellect would be my shield. The breach, they called it. A systemic failure, a security collapse, an unexpected opening in the most secure level, deep below where I worked with the forgotten archives. I remember the siren, the klaxon scream that tore through the sterile concrete halls, turning the air electric with dread. My initial fear was simple, primal. The prisoners were loose. They were out. I should have stopped then, should have let the panic consume me, but instead I retreated to the archives, not for safety, but for answers. I thought I needed to understand what exactly had escaped, to better prepare, to better track. My obsession with knowledge, my academic arrogance, was a far greater vulnerability than any structural weakness in these walls. But I kept reading, sifting through the forbidden codices, the condemned scriptures, the unholy geometries that constituted the deepest, darkest secrets of the Vatican's long-forgotten past. I found the Liber Nigrum Porters, the Black Book of Gates, bound in what felt like dried, flayed skin, its pages brittle with age and crackling with an almost audible malevolence. It was never meant to be opened, certainly not by me. The papal seal that had once graced its cover had been defaced, carved away with something sharp and furious, long ago. Within its decaying leaves, the truth, so much more horrifying than simple escape, began to take form, word by unholy word. The facility, this monumental structure of steel and concrete, this place I had believed to be a maximum security prison for entities, was never a cage. It was a lock. A massive, ritualistic lock, built over a natural chasm, a specific nexus point, a thin place where the veil between worlds frayed and thinned to nothing. The texts were clear, precise in their terrifying diagrams and their archaic Latin. Non est carcer, est porta. Non ad custodiendum, est ad claudendum. Et nunc aperta est. Not a prison, but a gate. Not for keeping, but for closing. And now it is open. I didn't realize then that the screams from the lower levels weren't of things escaping, but of things arriving. The dread began as a cold knot in my gut, twisting tighter with each translated passage, each blasphemous sigil I deciphered. The prisoners weren't beings contained here after they had threatened humanity. They were entities that had been drawn here, constantly pushing against the lock, testing its integrity, seeking the precise vibrational frequency, the specific incantatory breach that would allow them passage. The Vatican's centuries of work hadn't been about vanquishing evil, but about creating an impenetrable barrier against a persistent, insidious, hungry other. And now that barrier was compromised. That was only the first mistake. The book spoke of the names that summon, not just specific appellations, but vibrational keys, sonic rituals that could tear at reality. It listed them, not in words, but in complex, looping glyphs that seemed to vibrate on the page, almost humming beneath my fingers. I remember one, rendered as a series of nested circles and sharp, angular lines, accompanied by a warning in a script so old it predated most known languages. Nomen invocaris, et non erit locus ubi te celia pots. Invoke the name, and there will be no place where you can hide. I thought I was immune, safely separated by time and space, merely an observer of ancient madness. But the words, the symbols, they began to resonate. I started to hear things, faint, impossible whispers carried on the ventilation currents, not in any language I knew, but in a cadence that felt ancient, primordial, like stones grinding together in a buried deep. I thought I was imagining it, the creeping chill that had nothing to do with the facility's climate control, the sensation of being watched from the shadows between the overflowing shelves of forbidden knowledge. My mind, usually so sharp and analytical, felt like it was unwinding, thread by thread. Then came the blood, not from a cut, not from a wound, but appearing as a smear on the cold steel of my data terminal, a dark, viscous streak that wasn't there a moment before. My heart hammered against my ribs, a trapped bird desperate for escape. I wiped it away, my hands shaking, trying to rationalize, to dismiss it as rust, a trick of the dim lighting. But then a drop coalesced on the page of the Liber Nigrum Porters, shimmering black-red against the faded script, a single, perfect sphere before it absorbed into the ancient paper. I hadn't even scratched myself. My skin was intact, pristine. Yet the blood was undeniably mine, the metallic tang, the distinct, coppery scent. Panic truly set in then, a cold, unreasoning terror that froze my breath in my lungs. It wasn't just the breach that was open. I was open. This place wasn't just a gate, it was a conduit, and by diving into its lore, by touching the blasphemous texts, I had become an unwitting, unholy antenna. The blood stains had appeared before I even cut myself because something was already here, inside me, testing the boundaries of my own flesh, my own will. It was mapping my nervous system, learning the contours of my mind, finding the weaknesses, the fissures, the points of entry. The breach wasn't them escaping, it was them coming in. Not as a flood, but as an infiltration, a slow, methodical invasion. This realization, so clear now, felt less like a discovery and more like a dawning, terrible memory, as if I had always known but denied it. My mind isn't my own anymore. The thoughts I think, the words I write, they feel subtly influenced, nudged by an unseen hand, a foreign intelligence that observes, learns, and waits. How long until I am merely an echo? How long until I am just a puppet, and the strings are pulled by something that came through the gate? The true horror isn't the entities themselves, but the chilling realization that my sense of self is merely a temporary lease, soon to be revoked. The quiet is the worst part, not the sudden, jarring silence after the alarms shrieked themselves hoarse and died, leaving only the ringing in my ears. No, it's the insidious quiet that settled after that, when I realized the lack of screams wasn't a sign of safety, but of emptiness. Every cell door stands ajar, a gaping maw in the sterile hallway, beckoning towards what I cannot comprehend. I shouldn't have come back, shouldn't have sought answers in the dead heart of this place, but something pulled me here, to this terminal, to these blank pages. I started writing this report, a record, a warning, but even now, the words feel less like my own thoughts and more like etchings being carved from behind my eyes, guided by something that wants its story told, wants it spread. I remember the day I first accessed the restricted archives, a foolish act of curiosity fueled by whispers of forgotten documents and suppressed histories. The facility was designed to contain not just biological threats, but conceptual ones. Dangerous ideas, books that could unravel minds, artifacts that could rewrite reality. My security clearance, usually a barrier, felt like an invitation that day. I found it in subsection Gamma, beneath a lead-lined sheet, a leather-bound tome so old its pages were brittle with age, and the ink had begun to bleed into the parchment, a deep, unsettling crimson. It bore no title, only a single, stylized sigil that seemed to twist and writhe if I stared at it too long. I didn't realize then that merely touching it was the first mistake, the first transgression. But I kept reading, the forbidden fruit too tempting to resist. The initial entries were cryptic, fragmented Latin phrases, interspersed with meticulous diagrams. Archivum Secretum Vaticanum, Codices Obscura. It spoke of doctrines excised, entire branches of theological study deemed too perilous for human comprehension. It detailed rites performed not to summon, but to unbind entities from the fringes of existence, beings that predated even the oldest gods. I thought I was imagining the faint chill that seeped into my bones, the sense of being observed not by human eyes, but by something ancient and patient, watching from the shadows of the musty archive. The deeper I delved, the less sense the world around me made, and the more clarity the cryptic texts gained. Names. So many names, each a carefully constructed resonance meant to vibrate through the very fabric of reality. Names that were not merely labels, but keys. Ethelred, Malachar, Xylos. They weren't human, not even demonic in the conventional sense. The book referred to them as the resonance, beings that existed as pure information, pure concept, waiting for the right frequency to manifest, to coalesce. It claimed they fed on perception, on being known. And this book, this cursed compendium, was a menu. My mind, I now realize, was their new host. The alarms going silent wasn't an escape, it was an invitation. I should have stopped when the dreams began, vivid and suffocating, showing me impossible geometries and faces that shifted like static on a screen. I should have stopped when I found myself whispering the Latin phrases under my breath without conscious thought, feeling them resonate in my chest like a tuning fork struck against bone. The book, it wasn't just a record, it was a contagion. It wasn't about what I read, but that I read it, allowing the information to bypass my intellect and embed itself directly into my being. Later, I would understand that these names, these rituals, they weren't just for summoning. They were for transformation, for turning the reader into a gate, a mouthpiece. The shifts are subtle at first. A flicker of doubt regarding my own memories. A sudden, cold precision in my thoughts that feels alien. Then the feeling of a presence, not external, but deeply internal, looking out through my eyes. It started with minor compulsions, an inexplicable need to organize my workspace with a particular geometric symmetry, or the sudden urge to etch unfamiliar symbols onto the back of my hand with a pen. Now, it dictates the very words I type. My fingers move with an unnerving fluidity, composing sentences that feel both deeply personal and disturbingly foreign, weaving a narrative that serves its own arcane purpose. This report, this desperate attempt to document the collapse, has become its medium. It doesn't just record the story, it is the story, spreading its tendrils from mind to mind. The facility contains the physical threats, but it never accounted for the psychic contagion, the mimetic virus carried in ink and paper, or now in digital script. I was a guard, charged with keeping things in. Now I am merely a conduit, a vessel. The prison isn't the concrete and steel anymore. It's the knowledge, the infection that has taken root in my mind, and I am the last, unwilling prisoner, forced to serve my new masters by detailing their insidious rise. They want to be known, they want to spread, and this report, which started as a warning, is now their instrument. The silence of the facility echoes with their nascent power, a chorus of unspoken names waiting to be uttered, to be thought. Every word I type is a brick in the wall of my own mental confinement, a step further into an irreversible horror. I am writing this to you, but I am no longer sure if I am the one writing. I am merely the hand, the instrument, composing a message that has already chosen its recipient. And if you're reading this, why does the paper already know your name?